Hey everyone, before we dive into this story, I need to ask you something. YouTube's algorithm has been brutal lately, and our videos aren't getting the reach they deserve. If you find this analysis valuable, please hit that like button and drop a comment. Even just a word or two helps tremendously. The algorithm punishes channels that don't get early engagement, and I really need your support to keep bringing you this content. Alright, let's get into what just happened. Trump just detonated a tariff bomb across the American economy. 25% on aluminum, 25% on cars and auto parts. Lumber tariffs potentially doubling from 14.5% to 34.5%. The cost projections are brutal. $22,000 added to new home construction over the next 12 months, according to CoreLogic. $6,000 average price increase on vehicles. Aluminum smelter construction requiring 8 to 10 years, and commitments for 25 to 30 years of electricity supply that the United States hasn't built in 45 years. These aren't hypothetical projections. This is happening right now. Trump imposed these tariffs thinking he would force domestic production to return, manufacturing renaissance, American jobs, made in USA. Instead, he's created a supply crisis the United States cannot solve domestically for years, possibly decades. The country threw away 61 billion aluminum cans in 2024, recycled 46 billion more. 80% of aluminum used is recycled, but the metal for everything from aircraft to transmission lines to vehicles, that requires primary aluminum smelting. The United States has 4 aluminum smelters. 4, down from 30 a couple of decades ago. And building new ones requires 8 to 10 years, plus energy commitments the grid cannot provide because smelting aluminum is 6 times more power intensive than AI data centers. This isn't theory. This is happening right now. The US Midwest aluminum premiums increased over 60% between January and March 5th, 2025. Framing lumber composite hit $872 per thousand board feet. The National Association of Home Builders confirmed tariffs would add $6,000 to the cost of a typical new home. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is talking about declaring a national housing emergency. The United States is short 4.5 million homes, according to Zillow. And that shortage is growing. Housing starts are declining, not increasing. 1.36 million units last year, forecasted to drop to 1.2 to 1.3 million. The country needs 2 million units annually for a decade just to close the existing shortage. Today, we're showing you how Trump's tariff strategy weaponized trade policy to create permanent damage to American consumers, builders, and automakers. How Canadian aluminum, lumber, and auto parts supply that used to flow south is being redirected to markets that don't threaten tariffs every election cycle. How the mathematical impossibility of replacing Canadian imports in any reasonable time frame locks American industries into a crisis they cannot escape. And how the endgame leaves Canada diversified and independent, while United States households face the highest construction costs and vehicle prices in modern history. But before we dive into this story, if you appreciate in-depth analysis like this, hit that like button and subscribe to stay informed on the stories that truly matter. Let's start with what Trump actually did. In March of 2025, the administration announced 25% tariffs on aluminum, copper, lumber, and steel. Then 25% tariffs on all cars and auto parts not made in the United States and starting the following week. These weren't adjustments to existing trade policy. These were comprehensive tariff walls designed to force reshoring of manufacturing capacity. The aluminum tariffs applied not to whole products, but to the aluminum content of products, adding massive administrative complexity. Companies now have to calculate and report the exact aluminum percentage in every item crossing the border. The automotive tariffs hit vehicles and parts, stacking on top of existing tariffs in many cases. The industries targeted represent the backbone of American construction and transportation. Aluminum is in aircraft fuselages at 80% content, electrical transmission lines, vehicle components, building materials, beverage cans. The United States is the world's largest importer of raw aluminum, but lacks capacity to produce enough domestically. Canada accounts for 85% of all U.S. softwood lumber imports and represents almost a quarter of U.S. supply. Automotive supply chains are integrated across North America, with Canada providing natural resources and Mexico offering manufacturing at lower cost. Almost half of all vehicles sold in the United States are imported from Canada, Mexico, Europe's Hammerstick Festpermaison in Asia. Trump's tariffs don't just target one sector. They target the entire integrated manufacturing system built over 3 decades. Here's the critical context. The United States had 30 aluminum smelters a couple decades ago. Today it has 4. That drop is almost inconceivable, but it happened because aluminum smelting is extraordinarily energy intensive. 6 times more power intensive than AI data centers. 40% of the cost of producing smelted aluminum is the electricity that goes into the process. American electricity costs and environmental regulations made domestic smelting uncompetitive compared to production in Canada, China, India, Russia, the Middle East. Those countries built the capacity. The United States shut it down. Similarly, lumber production faced regulatory constraints from the Endangered Species Act of 1973 and National Environmental Policy Act of 1970. Mills closed across the Pacific Northwest and northern regions. The South became the dominant lumber producer, but total domestic capacity still falls short of demand by billions of board feet annually. But Trump didn't stop there. The tariffs on Canadian imports come with threats of additional tariffs stacked on top. Canada and China are among the biggest aluminum importers into the United States. The administration announced these steel and aluminum tariffs would add to any tariffs already in place. So Canadian aluminum potentially faces 25% base tariff plus additional levies if broader Canada trade disputes escalate. Canadian lumber already faces countervailing and anti-dumping duties of 14.5%. The Commerce Department is reviewing whether to more than double that rate to 34.5% later this year. The automotive tariffs stack similarly. Vehicles and parts from Canada and Mexico face 25%, even though both countries are integrated into U.S. automotive supply chains under agreements that were supposed to maintain tariff-free trade. The mathematical result is simple. American industries that relied on Canadian aluminum, lumber, and automotive components now face cost increases they cannot absorb and cannot pass entirely to consumers without destroying demand. Plus, they face administrative complexity calculating and reporting tariff liability on every shipment. Plus, they face supply uncertainty because Canadian producers are evaluating whether serving the United States market remains viable when the United States government weaponizes trade policy unpredictably. The tariffs hurt. Some mills closed, some workers got laid off, but survivors are being protected and supported by Canadian federal and provincial programs while they pivot away from United States markets permanently. Here's where it gets fascinating. The tariffs create immediate price increases, but the structural problem is the United States cannot replace Canadian supply in any reasonable time frame. Take aluminum smelting. A company planning a smelter in the United States today has to get the energy sector to commit to 25 or 30 years of electricity provision. Then it takes around 8 to 10 years to build the smelter, because you have to site it, permit it, build it, get it up and running. The United States hasn't built a primary aluminum smelter in 45 years. The only smelter project being contemplated right now will use between 700 and 1,000 megawatts of electricity and needs commitment to reasonable price rates for that electricity for a generation. That's a challenge the American power grid cannot meet when data centers and other industries are competing for the same electricity. Even if energy commitments materialize, we need to be cut out, which they won't quickly. The timeline is 8 to 10 years minimum before a single new smelter produces aluminum. In the meantime, the United States imports from Canada or pays higher prices for limited domestic production, or imports from India, the Middle East, Australia, or relies on China and Russia. But Canada's supplies are integrated into American manufacturing. Companies like Alcoa are heavily reliant on imports of aluminum from Canada. Every one job in Canada's aluminum industry supports 13 jobs in the United States because Canadian primary aluminum feeds American fabrication, manufacturing, and assembly. Tariffs don't just raise costs, they threaten to break the supply chain entirely if Canadian producers redirect volume to markets that don't weaponize trade policy. Lumber faces identical constraints. The United States has more than 765 million acres of planted and natural forest land. American softwood lumber production increased to 64 million cubic meters in 2023. But the country still faces a shortage because domestic production cannot meet demand. The mills that could increase capacity have been shuttered because home production has been down over the last couple of years. It's going to take years and millions of dollars in investment to reopen mothballed mills or build new ones. Even then, you need labor to take down timber, transport it to mills, process it, and deliver it to builders. That infrastructure and labor simply doesn't exist right now, and is very difficult to fill quickly. Experts suggest it could take at least 5 years for the United States to produce enough to match Canadian lumber imports. 5 years minimum. And that assumes regulatory reforms, capital investment, and labor recruitment all succeed simultaneously. This creates a fascinating dynamic. American construction costs are rising because domestic lumber and aluminum are more expensive than they used to be when companies could source from Canada without tariff penalties. Builders are absorbing higher costs or passing them to buyers, reducing demand. The National Association of Home Builders estimated tariffs would add $22,000 to the cost of newly constructed homes over the next 12 months when you account for aluminum, steel, lumber, and other materials. That's not just framing lumber, that's cabinets, windows, doors, roofing materials, siding. When you look in a home, you could throw a dart and hit just about anything impacted by the tariff discussion. The average new single-family home uses more than 2,200 square feet of softwood lumber and 15,000 board feet of framing lumber. The wooden frame is 15 to 18% of total construction costs. Meanwhile, Canadian producers face a situation where their largest export market just became hostile. Countervailing and anti-dumping duties have been in place for decades, but 25% tariffs or the threat of 34.5% combined rates change the calculation. Canadian lumber companies are evaluating whether to serve United States buyers at tariff-inflated prices or redirect volume to European and Asian markets, where demand is growing and trade relationships are stable. Canadian aluminum smelters that supply Alcoa and other American manufacturers are making the same calculation. Do we keep serving a market that threatens trade wars every few years, or do we build relationships with buyers in markets that value supply stability? The calling out has to be direct. The United States Lumber Coalition and aluminum industry groups keep claiming American production can meet demand. They're lying, or they're ignorant of their own industry's capacity constraints. United States annual lumber consumption runs around 70 billion board feet, including residential, commercial, and industrial use. Domestic production is roughly 58 billion board feet according to industry data. The math doesn't work without imports, and Canadian imports represent the largest share of that gap. Similarly, United States aluminum consumption far exceeds domestic smelting capacity. The country recycled 46 billion cans in 2024 and still needed massive primary aluminum imports for aircraft, vehicles, construction, and electrical infrastructure. You cannot replace decades of offshored capacity in months or even years. The structural deficit is permanent unless the United States makes energy commitments, regulatory reforms, and capital investments that would take a decade to show results. While American domestic industries struggle with higher costs and supply constraints, Canadian producers are executing an export pivot that doesn't include the United States as a priority market. Canadian lumber that used to serve American builders is being redirected to European and Asian construction markets. British Columbia lumber companies are establishing long-term supply contracts with builders in London, Tokyo, and Sydney. These relationships take years to build, but once established, they're permanent because buyers value supply stability over marginal price differences. Canadian aluminum smelters are similarly evaluating export markets in India, the Middle East, and Europe, where demand for primary aluminum is growing and governments aren't threatening trade wars. The relationship permanence is critical. When a Canadian lumber mill signs a multi-year supply contract with a European construction company, that volume is gone from American markets even if tariffs disappear. When a Canadian aluminum smelter builds logistical infrastructure to ship ingots to Asian manufacturers, those supply chains remain operational, because reverting to American buyers means re-exposing to tariff risk. Canada is learning the lesson that the United States is an unreliable customer that weaponizes trade policy for political purposes. Better to diversify export markets and reduce dependence on a buyer that might impose crushing tariffs with a single executive order. The human cost of this restructuring falls entirely on American consumers, builders, and automakers. The United States is short 4.5 million homes, according to Zillow. That number grew from 4.3 million recently. The shortage is getting worse, not better. Housing starts last year were 1.36 million units. Current forecasts predict 1.2 to 1.3 million. That's declining. The country needs to build roughly 2 million units annually for a decade just to close the existing shortage while keeping up with population growth. Instead, starts are falling. Why? Because construction costs keep rising. Lumber is 15 to 25% of the cost of building and finishing a home in the United States. When framing lumber climbs from $500 to $600 to $872 per thousand board feet, that cost flows directly to home buyers. The math breaks. A $200,000 home becomes $220,000 or $240,000 when lumber and aluminum costs rise 30 to 40%. Buyers who qualified at $200,000 cannot qualify at $240,000. Demand collapses. Rent prices stay elevated or rise further because rental housing construction faces the same cost pressures. Home ownership becomes less accessible. Household formation slows. Young families delay having children because housing is unaffordable. Multi-generational households become more common out of economic necessity, not cultural preference. The cultural shift toward home ownership that defined American prosperity for 70 years reverses. Over 100 million American households are unable to afford a median-priced home, which now sits at $460,000. The only way to solve the affordability crisis is to build more homes, but tariffs on lumber, aluminum, and other construction materials make building more expensive, not less. Automotive markets face parallel destruction. One thing's for sure, cars are about to get more expensive in the United States. Some may even be pulled from the market entirely. Analysts estimate 25% tariffs on vehicles, and parts could cause a 2.5 to over 3 million unit hit to sales volume. Prices are expected to rise on average about 15 to 20% for cars assembled outside the United States or containing imported parts. That works out to about a $6,000 price increase on average. The average transaction price for a car in the United States was just shy of $50,000 in February. Once you eliminate the low end of the market because cheap cars from Mexico and South Korea become unaffordable, the simple math throws that average way up. The average price will quickly crest $50,000 and go beyond. What that means is all of the cheapest new cars in the United States are now at risk of being wiped out. The Chevrolet Trax and Chevy Trailblazer, Nissan Sentra and Nissan Kicks, Buick Envista and Encore GX, Ford Bronco Sport, and Maverick. These vehicles are built in Mexico or South Korea and serve buyers in the $25,000 to $30,000 price range. When you add 25% tariffs, a $25,000 car becomes over $30,000. That segment of buyers cannot afford $30,000. They're priced out. General Motors has to decide whether to absorb part of the tariff, which destroys margins, or pass it to buyers, which destroys volume. Either way, GM may eliminate these vehicles entirely because they're no longer viable at tariff prices. If they eliminate those vehicles, consumers have no choice but to buy used. Used vehicle prices, which are still way above 2019 levels, even after COVID supply disruptions resolved, will rise further as demand shifts. It's not just cheap cars, it's also some of the most popular. The Toyota RAV4 and Honda CR-V are among the 5 models most affected when you multiply the number of cars sold by the cost of the tariff on each. Both sell well over 100,000 units annually in the United States. Both have significant imported content. Ford and Stellantis build 74 to 80% of their US market vehicles domestically, but GM builds less than half domestically. Every car has at least some parts or materials made outside the United States. Even companies less affected are likely to charge more because they can. When competitors raise prices due to tariffs, everyone raises prices. While American consumers face unaffordable housing and vehicles, Canadian industries that survived the initial tariff shock are now positioned better than they've been in decades. West Fraser, Canfor, Interfor, these lumber companies closed inefficient mills, focused on efficient modern operations, and used government support to cover transition costs. They emerged leaner, more profitable, and diversified across global markets. Canadian aluminum producers are making similar strategic adjustments. The tariffs forced restructuring that makes Canadian companies more competitive internationally because they're no longer dependent on a single customer that threatens their business model every election cycle. The end game is clear. The United States housing shortage doesn't get fixed, it gets worse. 4.5 million homes becomes 5 million, then 6 million, because the country cannot build at scale when construction costs include $22,000 in the tariff-related increases. Lumber, aluminum, steel, copper. Every material Trump tariffed is essential to home construction. The country cannot replace Canadian lumber imports for at least 5 years, assuming everything goes perfectly with regulatory reform, capital investment, and labor recruitment. The country cannot build new aluminum smelters for 8 to 10 years, assuming energy commitments materialize that haven't been made in 45 years. In the meantime, costs stay elevated, supply stays constrained, building slows down further, rent prices don't fall, they rise, home ownership rates decline, household formation slows, marriage rates drop, birth rates fall further. Multi-generational living becomes the norm. Young Americans accept they'll never own homes the way their parents and grandparents did. The wealth-building mechanism of home equity that created the American middle class becomes inaccessible to tens of millions. Over 100 million households already cannot afford median-priced homes at $460,000. When that median climbs to $500,000, then $550,000, the number of priced-out households grows. The cultural shift toward ownership that defined American prosperities reverses permanently because the country cannot build enough housing at costs working families can afford. Automotive markets face permanent contraction. The low end of the market, vehicles under $30,000, disappears almost entirely. The Chevy Trax, Nissan Sentra, Ford Maverick, all the entry-level models that serve first-time buyers and budget-conscious families either get eliminated or priced out of reach. Used vehicle prices stay elevated because demand shifts to the used market when new cars become unaffordable. But used cars don't expand supply. The total vehicle fleet available to American consumers shrinks. Fewer people can afford transportation. Job access becomes harder. Economic mobility decreases. The vicious cycle accelerates. Labor shortages get worse, not better. The lumber industry is already losing more people through retirement and job changes than entering the market. Immigration restrictions and deportation fears make recruiting even harder. Jobs in woodworking and logging are declining, with employment expected to dip 2 to 4% by 2033. The one thing about sawmilling, whether US or Canada, is trying to find skilled workers is very difficult. The green chain work is backbreaking, outdoors. Ailuk Gyoto in the elements, typically immigrant work. When those workers fear deportation, they leave the industry. When they leave, production capacity falls further. When production falls, prices rise more. Tariffs were supposed to bring jobs back. Instead, they're exacerbating labor shortages that make domestic production even harder. Canada, meanwhile, builds lumber, aluminum, and automotive component industries that serve domestic needs first, export to diverse international markets second, and view the United States as an unreliable customer that weaponizes trade policy and therefore doesn't deserve preferential access to Canadian resources. British Columbia lumber goes to London, not Seattle. Quebec aluminum goes to German manufacturers, not American automakers. Ontario auto parts suppliers establish relationships with European and Asian assembly plants, not Michigan and Ohio. These supply chains, once redirected, don't come back. The infrastructure is built, the buyer relationships are established, the contracts are signed. Even if tariffs disappear tomorrow, which they won't, Canadian producers have learned the United States cannot be trusted as a primary export market. The investments Canada is making right now aren't just surviving Trump's tariffs. They're restructuring Canadian industries for a post-United States export model, and that restructuring is permanent. Supply contracts with European and Asian buyers don't expire when American tariffs end. Infrastructure investments in port facilities for trans-Pacific and transatlantic shipping don't get reversed. Government procurement mandates prioritizing Canadian suppliers don't sunset. The diversification away from United States dependency becomes structural advantage because Canada's industries are no longer hostage to American political cycles. Trump thought threatening Canada with tariffs would pressure Canadian suppliers to accept whatever terms Washington demanded. He permanently severed the integrated supply chains that made North American manufacturing competitive globally. He made Canadian lumber more expensive for American builders, but gave Canada the justification and support to diversify away from United States markets entirely. He made American housing unaffordable and unsolvable at scale because domestic production cannot replace Canadian imports for years, and costs cannot fall while supply stays constrained. Canada paid short-term costs. Mills closed. Workers got laid off. Industries restructured under pressure. but Canada is emerging stronger, more independent, more diversified, and permanently positioned to serve global markets without dependence on a customer that proved it will weaponize trade relationships for political theater. The United States paid no short-term cost because the tariffs feel like action, strength, toughness. But the long-term cost is a generation of Americans priced out of home ownership, vehicle ownership, and economic mobility because their own government made essential materials unaffordable. Canada wins. The United States loses. And the end game is permanent.